Thank you, John, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back here, and thanks everyone for attending the talk. So I'm going to be speaking about technology innovation and the application of some of the understanding we've been developing over the years of the fundamental processes driving technological innovation and how we can use that to inform clean energy development through technology design and technology investment. So as many of you may know, technologies are not static in their performance. Performance tends to change over time, and there are two aspects of performance that are of interest when we're thinking about climate change mitigation and evaluating technologies against climate policy targets. Those are carbon intensity of energy and the cost of energy. And there's a range of other metrics that are also important. But in the next slide, I'm going to give you a sense of how cost and carbon intensity of electricity technologies have changed in the US over the years, just to kind of have an overview of this. So coal-fired electricity between 1902 and today changed in conversion efficiency from about 3% to 30%. Coming down that carbon intensity axis. And in terms of cost, really photovoltaics has shown a dramatic cost decline of about 10% per year since 1975. It's now 1% of the cost that it started out at in 1975. And then there are a range of other technologies, including gas and wind and solar and nuclear. Nuclear is one whose costs have actually increased over time due to increasing stringency of regulation. So if we look at photovoltaics, as I mentioned, this is a technology that's shown a very rapid cost decline. It's also grown quite rapidly at on average about 30% per year. And one of the questions is why is that? Is there something identifiable about this technology that causes it to improve very quickly? What is that? Can we use that to evaluate this technology and other technologies that are in the early stages of their development? So I'm going to go through quite a number of papers and results that are based on about a decade of work. And it's the first time I've given this talk, so I'm hoping, we'll see how it goes. I'm hoping that you'll be able to follow everything, and we can have a discussion at the end as well. But let me start with a description of a conceptual framework that I've developed for evaluating technologies like photovoltaics, for thinking about innovation and how to evaluate technology innovation against climate change mitigation goals. So to start out with, we can define technology innovation in this context as it's defined by, how I'm defining it is by increasing performance and prevalence. So prevalence is a measure of market uptake or growth, changes to market share and market size. And these feed into one another. So performance as a function of time, we can call that technology evolution. That feeds into prevalence as a function of time, which is technology diffusion. And prevalence then can feed back into performance as prevalence grows, markets grow, more effort is put into developing these technologies. So that's the working definition of innovation that I'll use in this, or the definition of equivalence of innovation that I'll use in this talk. And then if we look at market prevalence and thinking about what determines market prevalence, we can actually identify key aspects of performance that limit market prevalence. And each technology has a set of these key aspects. So in the case of photovoltaics, energy conversion cost is still one of the limiting factors. If we look at mobile batteries for electric vehicles, energy density is one of the limiting factors. And for stationary batteries, energy capacity cost. And there are a number of other performance metrics that influence market prevalence. And then if we think about what aspects of performance do we care about in looking at evaluating technologies and innovation against climate change mitigation, really any aspect of performance influencing prevalence is important, and then the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of these technologies. So this is kind of an overall framework for how we can evaluate technologies against climate change mitigation goals. That describes a lot of, that I use in a lot of the work that I'm doing. But in this talk, I want to focus on addressing three fundamental and applied research questions. One is, what drives technology improvement? Can we identify those drivers? Why do some technologies improve faster than others? And then can we use this knowledge to accelerate clean energy development? And there's a specific flavor, unique aspect of this work is a focus on really looking under the hood of technologies. And that's something that's actually helped me understand the process of innovation, what's really driving improvement of technologies over time. And then that can also teach us something about how we can speed up that process. So what aspects of a technology itself might influence the rate of innovation. And of course, it's not just the technology, it's also institutional design, policies, and so forth. But really going under the hood of technologies is something that I've been sort of bringing into studies of innovation and has been quite useful and revealing. So these are actually not my students. These are my students. And I'm going to be focusing in particular on work by a few of them. Magdalena Clément, James McNerney is a postdoc who's been working with me for many years as a grad student, now a postdoc, and Gökçen Kavlak. And a number of others have contributed, in the group have contributed to this work as well. Okay, so first, what drives technology improvement? What is actually going on under the hood of these technologies? To address this question, I'm going to look at one example, and that's photovoltaics, and present some new work that we're just in the process of writing up. I'm showing here the evolution of photovoltaics costs and price, and these are module costs and module prices. And we'll be looking at decomposing the cost trends that are shown here. So to start out with, and so I'm going to ask, what has driven this cost decline? What is it about this? What actually has added up to cause this rapid cost decline? As I mentioned, roughly 99% since the early 1970s, and about 85% in the last 15 years. One way, the way we've tackled this problem is to start out with a detailed cost equation. So I'm going to show that in the next slide. But basically, this is just decomposing all of the cost components of a PV cell down to from the smallest components all the way up to the module cost. So if you like equations, this is what the equation looks like. But the key point here is that this technology, really any technology, can be broken down into a combination of prices of raw material inputs, and that can be labor, physical materials and so forth, and usage ratios. And what we see is oftentimes our efforts to improve technologies either focuses on substitution, thereby changing prices, or improving usage ratios. So using less raw materials to provide the same output. So in looking at photovoltaics, I'm now going to group these cost components into three more aggregated cost components, and those are shown here. Those are silicon costs, non-silicon area-dependent costs, and manufacturing scale-dependent costs. The reason we're doing that is because that's what we have data for. We don't have unlimited data in this area. And then I'm going to look at some low-level mechanisms, what we're calling low-level mechanisms that act to change these costs. And these are some of the key low-level mechanisms that we've identified: module efficiency, yield of the manufacturing process, wafer area, and so forth. And going from here, we need to develop cost change equations for each of these key low-level mechanisms. So for example, if I want to look at the effect of a change in variable V on the overall module cost, I want to look at the change over the silicon-related costs, area-dependent costs, and non-silicon area-dependent costs, and the manufacturing scale-dependent costs. Okay, so silicon A and K for short. And in this case, I'm just showing the cost change equation for efficiency. And the main point here is just that it's actually not straightforward to look at the change of the effect that these low-level mechanisms have on the cost. We have to kind of study very carefully how they affect all the different cost components of the photovoltaic module. And even the mathematics, how to look at these, how to develop, how to model these cost changes is actually not straightforward because there are some, we're dealing with discrete variables here, and we have to decide how to assign cost changes to different mechanisms. So that required quite a bit of careful work, but we have what we think is a robust answer at this point. Okay, so how do these low-level mechanisms, how did they affect, how important were they in determining that dramatic cost change that we saw in photovoltaics? Well, you can see the breakdown here. So you can see that efficiency played a big role, non-silicon materials costs played a big role. And then we can then go from these low-level mechanisms to higher-level mechanisms that are shown here, including research and development, learning by doing, economies of scale, and other factors. And so what I'm going to be doing in the next slide is showing you some quantitative results in terms of the low-level mechanisms, but also the high-level mechanisms. Which of these explains photovoltaics cost decline? And so what's interesting here is that it basically allows us to go all the way back with this model, all the way back to the smallest components, or the smallest components for which we have data, of the photovoltaic cell in order to explain which of these high-level mechanisms that, say, policymakers might care about have been most important. And so the results are shown here, and this is from the period 1980 to 2012. And you can see that R&D has been quite important, economies of scale as well, learning by doing a little bit less so. Okay, so what did we learn then in answer to this first question by examining the example of photovoltaics? What drives technology cost improvement? Well, in the case of photovoltaics, there are various factors responsible. One is generally decreasing usage ratios. Efficiency played a really big role. Yield was quite important, and that's the yield of the manufacturing process. Economies of scale has played a very important role, and increasingly so in recent years. And then a kind of high-level takeaway that is actually has been quite useful in informing the policy discussion is that it's not just about research and development and publicly funded research and development, but market expansion has been very critical to driving the costs down. So a lot of the innovations actually happened in the private sector based on policy, given signals or policy-supported market expansion. So incentives that have driven market growth. This is something that we also see evidence of in the patent data. So just quickly, I wanted to show this graph here where we're looking at patents and on the y-axis. And what we see is that when we take into account market growth, we can much better predict or fit the actual trend in patents over time than when we just look at public R&D. So this is not as much of a mechanistic model, it's just empirical data and regression analysis, but it also gives us some evidence of the importance of market expansion in driving down the costs. And public R&D was also very important, but equally and actually more so in recent years. Market expansion was arguably more so in recent years. Okay, so now that we've gotten some insight into what drives technology improvement, I've looked at a couple of examples. Why do we think some technologies improve faster than others? moving on to that question. And very quickly, I want to talk about how we even start to answer this question, how we even quantify the rate. And so what I'm showing here are a couple of simple models that have been proposed in the literature. One is Moore's curve, and the other is Wright's curve, also known as the experience curve. These are very simple models for describing how a cost changes over time. And in figuring out how we describe the rate, a critical thing is to identify which one of these equations or some other equation might do best at describing the rate. And so we looked at a number of different technologies, not just in energy in this project, but many other technologies, a number of different models that have been proposed out there to say which of these models has more predictive power. Do they have any predictive power at all? And which one actually does best? And to do that, we looked at these 62 different technologies, separated out the random effects from the fixed effects, and compared the performance of these different models. And what we find is that, yes, several of these simple models do have predictive power. Wright's curve performed the best, followed very closely by Moore's curve. And these technologies do show different rates of improvement, that we can use these functional forms to describe the rate of improvement and study differences in the rate. So that was the first step in identifying how different technologies, their cost improvement over time. And now I'm going to ask, okay, well, again, this is just looking at the empirical data. What about some kind of mechanistic model for how technologies are improving? Can we develop such a model, and what does it tell us? So now I'm moving to a different approach, and this is another paper where here, this is actually a theory-based paper where we started with a simple model of the process of technology innovation, where you're essentially selecting components, trying to improve them, but those components are connected to a variety of other components. And what we find is from this very simple model, two things. One is that the functional form that pops out follows Wright's curve, or the kind of experience curve functional form up there on the right. And we solved this model analytically and also simulated this process. The other thing is that we see that the slope depends on the number and the nature of dependencies between components. So if components become, if you have a technology where the components are more dependent on one another, then you have slower improvement, whereas if you have a more modular technology, you have faster improvement based on the simulation. And what's nice about this is that there's actually data on something called design structure matrices that describe these component dependencies in a technology. So I'm showing a simple representation of one here. And so this model actually gives us this is actually this is a testable theory in that we can take design structure matrices for real technologies, compare them to rates of cost improvement that we've seen, and test the model. So that is a work in progress because we're still trying, this area is somewhat data limited, and we're still trying to identify sets of technologies for which we have both design structure matrices and performance curves. But theoretically, or actually in practice, once we have that, we can test the model. And even before we do that, this gives us a sense for early stage technologies of how quickly they might improve. So if you're thinking about comparing two different technologies that have different rates, that have different design structure matrices, you can map out those design structure matrices at the outset and have some sense for how technologies improve. And one more thing about this is that the model tells us something not just about the expected rate of improvement, but also how steady or jumpy we expect it to be, how erratic or jumpy. So if we have a technology where you have one bottleneck, you tend to see more jumpy improvement than if you have a more consistent network of dependencies across the different components. So anyway, so this gives us some sense that component networks in a technology might affect the rate of improvement. And if you want to design a technology or put your money into a technology, you might be well advised to choose one that has this more modular structure. And this model also gives us a kind of testable theory and mechanistic model of where that Wright's curve model may be coming from, why we may see that functional form. Okay, now I've been talking a lot about trends and how technology performance changes over time, but you may be asking, what about limits or cost floors? And that's something that we've looked at as well, and it turns out that there may be some predictability there too. So here, what I'm showing is coal-fired electricity in the US, the fuel cost, over time, and the conversion efficiency. And here you can see that increase in conversion efficiency that we saw in the first slide in that short video. And so we had an increase in the conversion efficiency of coal-fired power plants from about 3% in 1982 or 1882 to about 30% in 1960, and then this leveling off over time. And the effect that had was to level off the fuel cost. So as the efficiency leveled off, the fuel cost for coal-fired electricity leveled off as well. And effectively what this has done is to limit the rate of improvement of coal-fired electricity costs overall in the US. And now, the efficiency of coal-fired electricity could go up further. I mean, 30% is not any kind of fundamental limit, so it could increase further. But for the moment, at least, it is imposing a cost floor on coal-fired electricity costs overall. It represents about 50% of the cost of electricity from coal. So what's important about this for our purposes here is that we can take these input costs. So for example, the price of coal, we can take that as an input cost in our cost model and predict what these cost floors might be. So the theoretical or the ultimate cost floor for coal-fired electricity would be defined by the price of coal at 100% conversion efficiency. But we can take these prices of our input materials and quantify what we think the cost floor might be for technologies. And this also allows us to distinguish between technologies that are more on the one, what we've called commodity-like versus technology-like. So a technology-like technology is one that's further from its cost floor. A commodity-like technology is one that's closer to this limit or to this cost floor. Now you might be asking, do these cost floors change over time? Why am I assuming that the price of my raw material inputs is constant or fluctuating around a steady trend? And there are various factors that can change these cost floors over time. And in fact, cost floors can increase if you have material scarcity concerns. So this is another thing that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at, when we're answering the question, why do some technologies improve more quickly than others? What might limit long-term improvement, or what might slow the rate of improvement over time? So here what I'm looking at is, again, coming back to photovoltaics, and this is another model result where I'm looking at estimating material scarcity kind of ex ante in the early stages of a technology's development. So what we did here was to say, okay, let's look at the raw material inputs for the active materials of cadmium telluride photovoltaic cells and try to quantify whether we expect to see any kind of scarcity constraint or scarcity effects on input prices. And to get a sense of this, what we're looking at here are levels of cadmium telluride photovoltaics installation in 2030, projected levels, going from a few percent all the way up to 75%, just to look at a range, and then annual metal growth rates that would imply. So what is the growth rate in the production of these input materials that would imply? And what you can see here is that even for very small, relatively small installation levels of cadmium telluride in 2030, so for example meeting 3% of estimated electricity demand in 2030, you're already up at about 20%, at a 20% annual growth rate in production of tellurium. So this is kind of a red flag, and if we look at annual growth rates for a range of metals, so here we've taken all metals for which data is available, between 1970 and the present day. And you can see that 20% is actually a historically unprecedented rate of growth across the entire metals production sector. And so to meet 3% or more of electricity in 2030, tellurium would have to grow, with cadmium telluride PV cells, tellurium would have to grow at an unprecedented rate. So this is a note of caution, I think, when we're thinking. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest at all in CAD-TEL photovoltaics, but it does suggest that we should be looking at the scalability of these kinds of technologies. And so if we were to approach these levels of production growth rates, I mean, it's not likely to happen, but if that were to happen, it could actually raise the cost floor for this technology and limit its long-term cost improvement. And you might ask, well, what about silicon? If we do the same analysis for crystalline silicon cells, you can see that you can really meet, for this medium material intensity estimate, you can meet 100% of electricity in 2030 with crystalline silicon PV without exceeding that 95th percentile growth rate, annual growth rate in silicon production. So these are some ways in which we can understand why some technologies may improve more quickly than others. One is, just to summarize, the structure of a technology in terms of its component dependencies can influence that rate of improvement. Bottlenecks or very connected networks of components can slow the rate of improvement, and the network structure can result in steady or erratic improvement. And this is based on a theory that we developed. It is testable against the data, and there's some work that is required and some more data that's required to test that theory. But it does give us a way to evaluate early stage technologies. We can certainly map out the design structure matrices of these technologies to get a sense of, comparatively, is that network of components conducive to rapid improvement or not. Now, another thing that can matter is how far you are from cost floors. So commodity cost floors can slow the cost improvement of technologies over time. What we're calling commodity-like technologies are already close to their cost floor. And this commodity, for some technologies, this commodity cost floor can increase with the scarcity of, with scarcity of inputs. Okay, so those are some results on and some intuition for why some technologies might improve faster than others. And then let me just talk for a little bit about how we can take these more fundamental results, this understanding of the process of innovation, how we can feed that back into clean energy development. So there are two main areas in which I think these research results can help. One is in informing early stage technology design and also early stage technology funding. And one of the things that we're working on are a set of tools that can actually be used by policymakers and the private sector to evaluate technologies in the early stages of their development. So what are some of the lessons? well, we may be able to tailor component dependencies. And here I'm talking about components within the artifact itself, as well as components in the production process of manufacturing a technology. We can use this design complexity model and the design structure matrix to design for rapid improvement. We can also design for low commodity costs, and one of the tools for informing that is a cost decomposition and these cost equations that I mentioned. And really, as I mentioned in the beginning, all technologies can essentially be decomposed to their prices and usage ratios. And from that, we can very early on in the development of a technology estimate what the cost floors might be. We can also predict, to some degree, materials scalability constraints based on, in the example I showed, an ensemble data set from across the metals production sector. And one thing that we're working on right now is how to design for scale economies. And that's a model that's in progress. One of the things we're doing is to characterize the different kinds of scale economies that we see, and then think about how you might be able to design a technology to be able to benefit from scale economies. So these are tools that I think can be useful to R&D, portfolio managers. For example, we work a fair amount with the Department of Energy, also with firms, and then also can be useful for people working on, engineers in the lab working on designing technologies and thinking about how do I program into my technologies in the early stages, how do I design them or program in a propensity for rapid improvement over time. And there are also some lessons for climate policy. One is that market growth has been a critical driver of low carbon technology improvement. And in fact, there's some predictive power in some of these simple models, these models of that feedback. This is important in the context of climate policy because it suggests that emissions reduction and technology improvement can actually be mutually reinforcing, so that as you cut emissions, if you invest, if you make kind of sound and informed investments, you may actually be able to drive down the cost of emissions reduction over time. And this is something that we wrote about ahead of COP21 and presented at the White House. We had a chance to present the results of this report, technology improvement and emissions reductions as mutually reinforcing efforts. And from what I understand, this was quite useful in informing the US strategy. So here we have a blog by the White House ahead of COP, kind of summarizing this result. There's some language in the agreement itself emphasizing the enduring benefits and potential for future cost reduction due to early action and early mitigation efforts. And then also a highlight in the press release from the White House of this mutually reinforcing cycle in which enhanced mitigation can increase investment, and enhanced investment allows additional mitigation by driving down costs. So what I've described today is a set of projects that really try to go under the hood of technologies to understand the process of technology innovation. And that's led to an increased understanding of the processes driving technology innovation and the role of market growth in driving down the costs of low carbon technology. And as I mentioned, that has really important implications for climate policy. This kind of mutually reinforcing cycle between emissions reduction and technology improvement has been and can be in the future critical for global collective action. It can allow for things like kind of staging emissions reduction efforts by various nations based on their level of economic development. There's been a lot of discussion about the whether the Paris climate deal was ambitious enough. And one of the things that all of this research has suggested to me, and specifically the work we did on analyzing countries' contributions or pledges ahead of Paris, is that the answer really lies in the improvement, technology improvement that will come out of it. So if these pledges are met, if investments are made in such a way, and everyone in this room, all of us, are able to really improve low carbon technologies, then we could see significant benefit out of meeting countries' pledges, improvement or enhancement of our ability to reduce emissions further in the future. If we don't drive in, if these pledges don't result in innovation, then the benefits of meeting the agreement could be much less. But all of the past data that we have, and really these models and looking at what's driving technological change over time, suggests that there's actually some reason for optimism, that we've seen this really quite strong response to, one could argue, modest and not very well coordinated policies in the form of technology improvement. There's a long way to go, but I think there's also, there's signs of significant progress. And then also understanding technology innovation, these processes can also inform, as I mentioned, early stage design of technologies and research investment to achieve, hopefully, rapid improvement and also scalability of these clean energy technologies. So I think I'll stop there and take your questions. Thank you.
Jessika, thanks for pulling together all your work in such a focused and entertaining way. I'm reminded we do have an energy social in honor of Jessica's visit right after, starting in about 10 minutes, right outside the auditorium, food, drink, fun. That means at this point we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I'd like to start with the students in the back. Sir.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I was just wondering if you have a sense whether you're able to disaggregate the effects of different policies, and in particular, has it been more federal policies versus state policies that have driven the economies of scale?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, it depends on what components of a technology you're looking at. So if we're looking at, for example, if we're looking at policies that have stimulated market growth, really what's relevant, in my view, is just the overall size of those markets and growth globally over time for some components of a technology. So that includes, in the case of photovoltaics, the module, the inverter. Now, for balance of systems, it's a different story. So that's the rest of the PV system. And there we see a lot of variability in costs across different locations. We don't have global markets for balance of systems yet. And so there it could be interesting to see which policies have been most effective. I do know that researchers have looked at, for example, at NREL, looked at a comparison of Germany and the US. And Germany's actually been able to, partly through the structure of, it's various factors, actually has much lower costs, balance of system costs than the US. So that's kind of at that level, I think, it can really matter how these policies are structured.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, how have you modeled, the interaction between the technology and the various components in the value chain? For example, take LNG, natural gas. So, the LNG terminal development, the transportation cost, and finally the power plant cost. So, how do these these components interact with each other, and how do we sort of inform your cost deployment curves?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really about what cost, at what point in that value chain or supply chain you're studying the cost. So, for example, in the case of coal-fired electricity, when we looked at decomposing those costs, we took into account everything up to the bus bar cost of electricity. And so we look at transportation, we look at all of the upstream, all of the costs that come further upstream. So it's really about defining the point of comparison and thinking about that carefully, and then accounting for all of the costs further upstream. Yeah.
One more student, and we're going to have Blue and Charlie. One more student question. Great.
Thanks for the talk. Maybe this is just a comment, if you can help me understand it. So in the graph where you showed the price of the fuel, and then the efficiency of the technology, and then you implied some kind of a correlation.
Yeah.
So if you think about natural gas, so say natural gas price is going down because of fracking. Now, if I am investing in a new natural gas power plant, why would the dropping price of natural gas incentivize me to improve the efficiency? I will keep the efficiency the same and not invest in R&D because the cost of my fuel is down. So I'm just not understanding the causal relationship that you implied between these two graphs, that as the cost of the fuel goes down, the efficiency is necessarily going to improve.
Yeah, I wasn't implying a causal relationship of one driving the other. I was just saying that the efficiency is influencing the fuel cost. So here we're looking at the fuel cost in cents per kilowatt hour. And so this declining fuel cost was due to an increasing conversion efficiency. So it's dependent. The fuel cost is dependent on the conversion efficiency. If you decompose the fuel cost, the efficiency appears on the right-hand side of that decomposition. So I'm not implying that one would incentivize the other. So you're thinking, I think you're thinking about fuel prices. Right, and so that's something. So if we looked at fuel prices, we have those trends too. They're basically fluctuating around a steady trend. And there's all sorts of reasons for why that is. I mean, you might ask why, for all of these commodity costs, we don't tend to see a trend up or down. And there's some balancing happening in terms of difficulty of extracting the resource and technology improvement in extracting that resource that seems to balance itself out. And it's also market. A deficient market, we would expect that to be the case as well. So yeah, but I'm not implying a dependency there.
Gentlemen here, Charlie Colesberg, can help you, and then
The stack chart of, I think you called it low-level influences.
Yeah.
And then the high-level influences adjacent to that.
Yeah.
On the stack chart was plant size, and on the high level was economies of scale.
Right.
Please help me distinguish between those.
Yeah, so the plant size is basically just everything on the left-hand side is, those are mechanisms that act on measurable variables in the cost equation. So the plant size, in our model, we have a dependence of cost on plant size. So that shows up in the low-level mechanisms. And then, but plant size is really what, the change due to plant size is really what is determining economies of scale. So if in the left-hand side, plant size is contributing a lot, a very large fraction of the total, then on the right side, economies of scale will be an important driver. Yeah.
Charlie Colesberg.
We usually think of technological innovations driving down the cost, and those are the examples you have here. We also have examples where innovation, technological improvement tends to drive up the cost.
Right.
Think of nuclear power, synthetic fuels. Mm-hmm. Are your models able to explain those developments as well as the declining costs?
Right, right. Well, so the way I think about it is, I'll give you an answer. I think it would be very interesting to try to tease out, to model those competing effects. I haven't done that yet, but the way I think about it is you have a set of performance criteria that are of interest. in the marketplace that determine, that these technologies are competing with one another based on this set of performance criteria. And some of that comes from, can come from regulation. So in the case of nuclear fission, we can think about, one of the performance criteria is everything that we need to comply with increasingly stringent regulation over time. So that's tending to drive the cost up. At the same time, companies are trying to keep costs down. And the question is, which one of these wins out? Another example could be the Ford Model T, right? For a long time, we saw costs coming down. And then we diverged from that trend when consumers started to value other performance metrics like aesthetics, acceleration potential, power of the engine, et cetera. And that caused a divergence from that trend. So it's really about, what companies are all trying to predict what will make their product popular and what will allow them to gain market share. And then trying to improve the technology along those lines while keeping costs low. So that's really when we're studying the potential for a technology to grow in prevalence, we want to look at all of those factors. But sometimes you get regulation imposed from the outside. Yeah.
Can you go back to your slide on the decomposition of causes for improvement in solar PV prices? And that's usually used as the poster child for improvement by learning by doing. And you
Right.
take a relatively small
Yeah.
fraction of that. Maybe just expand on that.
Yeah. So I would say that.
Keep that slide.
Oh yeah. I'm just. We haven't published this paper yet, so that's why I'm sort of trying to go through. But no, okay. So don't quote me on this. We're still in prep. Okay. So in any case, yeah. So learning by doing. Okay. So it just, it wasn't a dominant factor. Does that mean we should throw out the experience curve as a model? Well, we should probably maybe we should call it something other than the experience curve, but we don't have to throw out that functional form for whatever reason, and it has, I think the theoretical model gives some insight on that. Costs tend to follow that functional form, but it's not just learning by doing that's giving rise to that. There are many other factors that are important.
Since we're still having fun, I'm going to allow two more, Sally and the gentleman over there.
Yeah, mine is really related to that one, sorry. So how do you distinguish the benefits of R&D as compared to learning by doing in this? Can you give like an example of something specific where it was not learning by doing and it was R&D?
Yeah, so efficiency would be a great example of R&D. So we're assigning that to R&D. So I should mention, there's some subjectivity in assigning the low-level mechanisms to these high-level bins. We're assigning them, yeah. So that's kind of, here we're selecting the primary high-level mechanism for each variable. In the paper, we have a sensitivity analysis where we look at, if we make other selections, because for some of them, it's not absolutely clear which bin they should go in. Efficiency, I'm pretty comfortable, goes into R&D. It doesn't mean publicly funded R&D, privately funded in many cases, right? But with some of the others, yield and silicon usage, it's pretty clear, but even when we look at those that are less obvious matches, you still get the same dominant trends, which is, yeah.
One more quick question over here. Just wondered if you looked at all at modules that are shared across industries. So for instance, in the solar side, the chip processing might be shared with the chip industry, the silicon processing might be shared with the chip industry. And obviously on the energy storage, the battery stuff might be shared with laptops or whatever.
Yeah.
So the fact that you have a module that's in multiple industries, or at least two prominent industries, would cause improvements to occur quicker.
Yeah, so I'll say that we've considered this in this category of spillover, but it's not the final word on the issue because, there could be some of these other improvements could actually have benefited from improvements in other industries. So for right now, it doesn't look like a dominant factor, but it's something that I would like to look at I think it has played a role. I don't think it's going to turn out to be the dominant factor, but we need to look at, I have some other ideas for how to get at that, and it involves actually looking at the scientific literature, patents, and so forth. I think this isn't the best model for answering that kind of question. But I think generally speaking, it's played some role, but probably not the dominant one. Yeah.
So with that, let's thank Jessika one last time and then party.